Welcome to the real story of Henry VIII. He was a king whose body began to decay before death ever came. His wounds seeped with infection, and the stench of his rotting flesh lingered far beyond the walls of his chamber. His marriages often ended in tragedy, turning vows into verdicts. Under his reign, the Tower of London became more feared than ever before. This is the unsettling truth behind the life of Henry VIII. Believe me, what you're about to uncover will make your darkest nightmares feel almost comforting. To many, Henry VIII is remembered as the jovial, larger-than-life king with a notorious habit of losing wives. But the real story is far more disturbing, so twisted and brutal that generations of historians have tried to smooth over the horrors of his reign. Behind the crown was a ruler whose legacy reads more like a Gothic horror than a royal biography. We're about to explore the life of a ruler so consumed by paranoia that he reportedly slept beside loaded firearms. His appetite was so excessive, even modern-day competitive eaters would turn away in revulsion. And his treatment of women went far beyond execution. It delved into a kind of psychological torment that would disturb even the darkest minds of today. But before we unravel this royal nightmare, don't you forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments where in the world you're re-listening from. I'm truly amazed by how we're all connected from different corners of the world. It's a powerful reminder of how history brings us together. But brace yourself, because once you uncover who Henry VIII truly was, your view of the Tudor era and royal authority may never be the same. Let's begin with one of the most gut-wrenching truths about this infamous king. By the last decade of his life, Henry VIII had become something straight out of a horror story. This wasn't just a case of poor health or excessive weight. His body had deteriorated into such a revolting state that even people of the time, who were no strangers to disease and filth, found him unbearable to be around. The transformation from a vibrant, athletic young prince into a grotesque shell of a man began in 1536, following a devastating jousting accident, an event that would mark the beginning of his physical and mental decline. At a tournament held at Greenwich Palace, Henry suffered a severe blow that left him unconscious for more than 2 hours. A terrifying event in an age when medical knowledge was rudimentary at best. For all intents and purposes, he had been clinically dead. When he finally came to, those around him began to notice something unsettling. The once reasonable young monarch began to spiral. His moods became darker, his temper more volatile, and his behavior dangerously unpredictable. Paranoia, violence, and erratic decisions would soon define the rest of his reign. But it wasn't just his mind that changed. The physical toll was even more disturbing. The injuries he sustained during the jousting accident left him with deep leg wounds that never truly healed. Over time, those injuries worsened into open, festering ulcers that steadily ate away at his lower limbs. And these weren't minor scrapes or surface cuts. These were gaping, infected wounds that reeked and oozed, turning his body into a source of constant agony and revulsion. These were not just wounds, they were massive, open sores that continuously leaked pus, blood, and the stench of decaying flesh. The odor was so overpowering that courtiers reportedly gagged when approaching the king. Contemporary witnesses claimed the foul smell could be detected from multiple rooms away. Servants tasked with caring for him often covered their faces with scented cloths, and some were even driven to vomit purely from the overwhelming stench. Even the king's personal physicians were repulsed by the state of his legs. Some reportedly went so far as to invent excuses to avoid tending to him, despite knowing that refusing royal care could be seen as an act of treason. As the years passed, Henry's health continued to decline. His weight soared to extreme levels, eventually reaching around 400 pounds, with a waistline measuring a staggering 54 inches. The once athletic young monarch had become almost unrecognizable, a man imprisoned in his own failing body. To put it in perspective, his waist alone was wider than the height of many adults. His face grew so bloated with fat that his eyes were reduced to narrow slits, nearly lost within the mass of his swollen features. His neck vanished entirely, giving him the appearance of an enormous, overinflated balloon perched awkwardly on his shoulders. Henry's mobility deteriorated to the point where he could no longer walk on his own. Custom-built chairs equipped with pulleys and wheels had to be designed just to move him through the palace halls. Entire teams of servants were assigned to manage these devices, essentially hauling the ailing king from chamber to chamber. But here's the most unsettling detail. As they transported him, bits of decaying tissue would occasionally slough off his legs, leaving behind a grotesque trail of royal flesh across the stone floors. Palace servants were assigned to follow closely behind the king's rolling chair, armed with cloths and buckets tasked with cleaning up the decaying remnants of his body that fell to the floor. Just imagine, your official duty as a royal servant involved collecting chunks of rotting flesh from the monarch himself. The psychological toll was immense. Many became so disturbed by the daily horror that they abandoned their posts entirely, despite the high honor and rare privilege of serving the king directly. The psychological toll on those in Henry's inner circle was profound. Where courtiers had once vied for the privilege of standing near the monarch, many soon came to fear even the thought of being summoned. His grotesque appearance, the overwhelming stench that preceded him, and his increasingly volatile temper made court life unbearable. For those who served him, the palace no longer felt like a center of power, but a waking nightmare. But Henry's physical decay was only the beginning of this royal horror story. The brain trauma he suffered during the jousting accident didn't just change his body, it rewired his mind. Where once he had the ability, or at least the desire, to maintain a veneer of civility, that restraint slowly vanished. In its place emerged a ruler who seemed to take a disturbing satisfaction in the suffering of others. A king transformed into something far more terrifying than just a tyrant. The same man who once penned heartfelt love letters and composed tender melodies eventually became a ruler capable of ordering brutal executions over the slightest insult. He didn't just punish you, he made spectacles of suffering, forcing people to witness the deaths of their loved ones before meeting the same fate themselves. Modern medical experts now believe that Henry may have suffered from a combination of chronic illnesses and neurological disorders conditions that would have made his final years both physically agonizing and mentally unstable. In addition to his obvious obesity and the festering leg ulcers, modern researchers suspect that Henry may have suffered from Cushing's syndrome, condition that could explain his extreme weight gain, unpredictable mood swings, and chronic wounds that refused to heal. He may have also developed diabetes, further complicating his already life-threatening infections and amplifying the constant pain he endured. The most tragic irony of all? Henry, who so boldly declared himself chosen by God to rule, spent his final years unable to control even the most basic functions of his own body. Henry's condition had deteriorated so severely that royal attendants were forced to bring specially made portable toilets with him wherever he went. He was no longer able to move between rooms without risk of soiling himself. And as a haunting contrast, the same man who ordered executions over minor slights now found himself unraveling physically and publicly in the most humiliating ways imaginable. Everyone remembers the famous rhyme about Henry VIII's wives. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. It's a rhyme nearly everyone knows. But this neat little summary barely scratches the surface of the nightmare these women truly lived through. We're not just talking about execution. We're talking about relentless psychological torment, gaslighting, isolation, public humiliation, and the constant threat of death. Henry didn't simply end his wives' lives. He shattered their spirits first, turning the role of queen consort into a waking horror. For many women of the time, marrying the King of England wasn't a dream. It was the most terrifying fate imaginable. Let's begin with Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, and arguably the one who endured the longest and most drawn-out psychological torment. Catherine wasn't merely cast aside. She was systematically isolated, stripped of her title, separated from her daughter, and publicly humiliated all, while being forced to maintain the dignity of a queen. When Henry set his sights on Anne Boleyn, he didn't simply request a divorce. He waged a brutal campaign to break Catherine down, challenging the legitimacy of their marriage, pressuring the church to invalidate it, and casting her into political and personal exile. Many historians even believe her eventual death may have involved poisoning, though officially it was blamed on illness, yet another layer to the quiet tragedy of a queen who had once ruled with strength and grace. Instead of granting a dignified separation, Henry declared that their 24-year marriage had never been legitimate in the eyes of God, effectively accusing Catherine of having lived in sin for over 2 decades. It was more than a personal rejection. It was a complete erasure of her status, her dignity, and the life they had built together. But the cruelty didn't end with public disgrace. Henry went further, forbidding Catherine from seeing their daughter, Mary. He turned their only child into a tool of punishment, weaponizing the maternal bond to break Catherine emotionally, day by day. Imagine being told you could no longer see your own child, not because she had been taken ill, not because of war or distance, but because your husband had declared that your marriage never truly existed. That was Catherine's fate. She spent her final years in enforced isolation, essentially under house arrest. She was stripped of her royal title, forbidden from receiving visitors, and cut off from the world she had once ruled beside her husband. Worse still, she lived under the constant threat of execution, unless she agreed to accept Henry's false version of reality, that she had never been queen, never been a wife, and never truly belonged. The psychological warfare Henry waged against Catherine was as deliberate as it was cruel. One day he would send her gifts and letters filled with warm, conciliatory words. The next, he would threaten her with charges of treason offenses that could carry the weight of a death sentence. He coerced her into signing documents declaring their marriage invalid, only to later reverse course and demand she sign others with contradictory statements. It was a relentless cycle of manipulation, gaslighting, and emotional torment. Over time, the constant stress, fear, and humiliation took a devastating toll. Catherine's body began to break down her physical illness, mirroring the damage done to her spirit. Catherine's health steadily declined. She developed severe stomach issues, what many historians now believe were the physical manifestations of prolonged emotional trauma, and possibly the result of slow poisoning. When she died in 1536, Catherine passed away alone, surrounded only by a few loyal attendants. Henry didn't attend the funeral. He even forbade their daughter, Mary, from saying goodbye to her mother on her deathbed. In her final letter, Catherine pleaded with Henry to show kindness to their daughter and ended with a profession of undying love. That letter was never answered. The man she had served faithfully for more than 2 decades couldn't be bothered to acknowledge her death. But if Catherine's end was tragic, Anne Boleyn's was a descent into orchestrated horror. Because with Anne, Henry didn't simply grow tired. He unleashed a masterpiece of cruelty. When he resolved to rid himself of Anne, he didn't issue a direct order. Instead, he staged a carefully planned campaign to break her spirit peace before ending her life. It began with the arrest of her personal musician, Mark Smeaton, who was tortured until he confessed falsely to having an affair with the Queen. But Henry wasn't satisfied with a single coerced confession. He ordered the arrest of 4 more men, including Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. They too were accused of adultery with the Queen, and under intense pressure were forced to confess to crimes they never committed. For Anne, the psychological torment was unimaginable. Watching innocent men friends, allies, and her own family being destroyed simply because of their connection to her must have been soul-crushing. But Henry's cruelty hadn't yet peaked. In an act of calculated sadism, he forced Anne to witness the executions of all 5 men. She stood by as her brother was beheaded, his severed head held aloft for the cheering crowd. The message was clear. This wasn't just punishment. It was a performance meant to break her completely before her own death. Even Anne's execution became a twisted ritual of psychological warfare. Henry initially sentenced her to be burned at the stake, the standard punishment for a woman convicted of adultery. Then, in what he framed as an act of mercy, he changed the sentence to beheading. But the mercy was hollow. Rather than allow her execution to proceed quickly, Henry imported a specialized swordsman from France, allegedly to ensure a swift and painless death. In truth, this delay prolonged Anne's agony. She was left to wait in suspense for several more days, knowing each hour brought her closer to death, yet never quite knowing when it would come. Anne spent her final days imprisoned in the Tower of London, suspended between moments of eerie calm and sudden outbursts of hysteria. Some days she would pray for hours in silence. Other times she would laugh uncontrollably, as if trying to detach herself from the horror of her reality. The psychological strain was immense. She was facing death for crimes she hadn't committed, crimes that had already claimed the lives of 5 innocent men. It was clear the trauma had pushed her to the very edge of sanity. But even after Anne's execution, Henry's pattern of cruelty continued. The story of Catherine Howard, his 5th wife, is perhaps the most disturbing of all. Catherine was barely more than a teenager, no older than 19 or 20, when Henry, now in his late 40s, grotesquely obese, and suffering from festering leg wounds, chose her to be his next queen. The marriage itself must have been terrifying. Imagine being a young girl, still barely past childhood, forced to share a bed with a man whose body was literally decaying. But what followed was even more chilling. When Henry learned that Catherine had engaged in sexual relationships before their marriage, his response revealed just how deeply he was willing to wound, not just punish, because Henry didn't simply execute Catherine. Henry went so far as to pass a law making it high treason for anyone to marry the king without fully disclosing their sexual past. Think about the astonishing level of ego and insecurity required to reshape the very foundations of English law simply because his teenage bride wasn't a virgin. But Henry's cruelty toward Catherine didn't stop with legislation. He had her imprisoned in the Tower of London for months, where she lived in limbo, never knowing if she would be spared or condemned. He sent her conflicting messages, some days offering vague promises of mercy if she confessed her sins, and other days detailing exactly how her execution would be carried out. This emotional whiplash was not accidental. It was designed to break her. The psychological torment was so intense that Catherine reportedly suffered multiple nervous breakdowns during her confinement. Guards described her slipping between long stretches of eerie silence and sudden, uncontrollable screaming that echoed through the cold stone halls of the tower. By the time her execution date arrived, observers said she looked as if she had aged years in just a matter of weeks. This wasn't justice. It was the slow, deliberate unraveling of a young mind by a man who had grown addicted to control, cruelty, and fear. The immense stress had changed Catherine Howard's appearance so drastically that, by the time she faced the executioner, she seemed almost unrecognizable, aged far beyond her years. But even those who died of so-called natural causes were not spared Henry's cold indifference. Take Jane Seymour, often remembered as the lucky wife simply because she died before Henry could turn on her. But Jane's story quietly reveals yet another side of Henry's cruelty, one that was less dramatic, but just as chilling. Jane died shortly after giving birth to Henry's long-awaited son, Edward. You might expect the king to be devastated. Instead, within just 9 days of her funeral, Henry had already begun making arrangements for his next marriage. There was no period of mourning, no deep reflection, just a swift pivot towards securing his next queen. But the most telling moment came not after Jane's death, but during the birth itself. Jane was in labor for over 30 hours, clearly in agony. Yet according to historical accounts, Henry's physicians were far more concerned with preserving the life of the infant heir than the mother. Some sources suggest that Henry gave direct orders to prioritize the child, survival over Jane C., effectively reducing her to nothing more than a vessel for producing a male successor. That's the pattern. Women as tools, not people. Which brings us to Anne of Cleves, another wife often described as lucky, simply because she managed to survive her marriage. But Anne's story isn't one of luck. It's a disturbing example of massive psychological manipulation, orchestrated by a king who was growing more erratic with every passing year. When Henry decided he no longer wished to remain married to Anne of Cleves, he gave her two options: public humiliation or execution. Terrified, Anne agreed to an annulment under immense psychological pressure, essentially pretending the marriage had never happened. She was so afraid of sharing the same fate as Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard that she thanked Henry for his mercy in sparing her life. Imagine the emotional toll of being forced to erase your own marriage from history and to express gratitude for not being beheaded. Anne spent the rest of her life living on the fringes of court, officially honored but quietly erased. Her survival came at the cost of her dignity and truth. And then there was Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife. Often remembered as the one who survived, few realize just how narrowly she escaped death herself. At one point, Henry had actually signed her arrest warrant, accusing her of heresy for her reformist religious views. The only reason she survived was because she recognized the danger and played a careful game of submission. She approached Henry with calculated humility, claiming that she had only ever spoken about religious matters to distract him from his pain and to learn from his superior wisdom. The king, flattered by her apparent obedience, rescinded the warrant, proving once again that to survive Henry VIII, you had to become a master of psychological self-defense. These women weren't just historical footnotes in a rhyme. They were human beings caught in the orbit of a man whose power, paranoia, and pride turned love into fear and marriage into a form of courtly survival. When Catherine Parr discovered that Henry had signed a warrant for her arrest, she responded not with defiance, but with careful submission. She approached the king and humbly explained that her religious conversations were not meant to instruct him, but to learn from his superior wisdom. This calculated flattery was enough to save her life, at least for the moment. But imagine the psychological burden of living with that knowledge, of knowing that one wrong word, one misinterpreted phrase, could cost you your head. Catherine spent her marriage in a state of constant vigilance, walking a mental tightrope every time she opened her mouth. Her story, like that of every woman Henry married, reveals a deeper truth. These women were trapped. Divorce wasn't truly an option. Fleeing would be considered treason. And standing up for themselves could mean not only their own execution, but the destruction of their entire families. They were bound to a man whose body was decaying and whose mind had become dangerously unstable. With each passing year, Henry grew more unpredictable, more volatile, more terrifying. For these women, there was no freedom, only survival or death. If you think modern competitive eating is intense, consider this. Henry VIII didn't just eat like a king, he ate like an empire. His daily intake in later life was staggering, estimated at around 5,000 calories a day, more than double the recommended amount for a physically active man. And Henry was anything but active at that stage. He could barely move without assistance. But the troubling part wasn't just the quantity. It was the ceremony around his meals, the elaborate rituals and security precautions that turned dining into a kind of royal performance. A typical dinner might feature an entire roast pig, multiple chickens, several kinds of fish, towering piles of bread, and enough wine to leave a whole court intoxicated. And this was just for one man. Behind the scenes, The royal kitchens were a logistical marvel and a nightmare. Over 200 staff members worked tirelessly, preparing more than 800 separate dishes daily to feed the court. Henry would personally sample dozens, each one first tasted by servants to ensure it wasn't poisoned. Food, for Henry, wasn't just sustenance. It was power, pleasure, and paranoia rolled into one. The act of eating had become both his comfort and his downfall. More people worked in Henry's kitchens than are employed in many modern restaurants today. But this was more than excess. It bordered on obsession. You see, Henry's relationship with food wasn't just gluttonous. It had veered into delusion. He truly believed that certain foods possessed mystical properties, capable of enhancing his strength, agility, and even his romantic prowess. For example, he insisted on eating swan, convinced it would make him more graceful, despite the fact that by this point, he needed mechanical devices just to stand. He devoured venison regularly, claiming it would sharpen his hunting skills, even though he could no longer mount a horse or handle a bow. But perhaps the most telling was his obsession with oysters. Henry was certain they would improve his performance in the bedroom. He would eat them by the dozens before visiting his wives, completely ignoring the reality that his decaying body and overpowering stench were far greater obstacles than any imagined dietary shortfall. And then there were the rituals. Every single dish served to the king underwent multiple rounds of tasting, performed by royal food testers whose job was to protect the monarch from poisoning. But Henry's paranoia pushed things further. Not only did these tasters sample every bite, they were required to wait half an hour after eating, standing nearby, just in case the food contained a slow-acting poison. Only if they remained alive and well would Henry dare to eat. What began as royal indulgence had evolved into something more disturbing. A world where fear, fantasy, and obsession shaped the very act of eating. But even those elaborate precautions weren't enough to quiet the growing paranoia in Henry's mind. He ordered that his meals be prepared only in sealed royal kitchens, guarded by armed sentries who watched every movement of the cooks. Every ingredient from the salt to the spices, even the water itself, was tested by separate individuals, as if each component might hide some invisible threat. What should have been a simple supper became a full-scale military operation, requiring dozens of staff and hours of preparation. And then came the performance. For Henry, dining wasn't just sustenance, it was spectacle. He often ate in front of hundreds of courtiers, who were expected to observe, admire, and feign delight. Meals could last up to 4 hours, as the king slowly worked his way through course after course, consuming enough to feed a small English village. Imagine it, rows of nobles sitting in stunned silence as this grotesquely swollen monarch, barely able to move, slowly devoured platter after platter of meats, stews, and pastries. All the while, the smell of decay from his infected legs drifted through the hall like an uninvited guest. Yet no one could flinch. Smiling was mandatory. Applause was expected. To show disgust or even boredom was to risk offending a man who had sent friends, wives, and ministers to their deaths for far less. These meals became more than banquets. They were psychological trials. Those in attendance were not simply guests, they were hostages to Henry's ego, forced to witness a spectacle that blurred the line between ritual and madness. At court, no one dared show even the faintest sign of discomfort. A misplaced expression, a poorly timed glance, even the subtle act of turning away from the table too soon. Any of these could be interpreted as criticism of the king's behavior, a dangerously thin line between etiquette and treason. In this environment, meal times became rituals of forced admiration, where courtiers performed smiles and polite conversation, while silently enduring what was, for many, a form of collective psychological strain. To question, or even appear disturbed by, the king's behavior was unthinkable. Henry's paranoia extended to the food itself. Certain dishes' humble fare, like turnips, barley, or peas, were banned from the royal table, not because they were unhealthy, but because they were associated with the common people. In Henry's view, such ingredients were beneath his royal station, no matter their nutritional value. The irony is hard to miss. While Henry feasted daily on rich meats, sugary desserts, and rare delicacies, much of England was grappling with food shortages, inflation, and harvest failures. The royal kitchens consumed enormous quantities of resources: grain, livestock, spices that could have fed entire villages. And all of it funneled into a court that existed almost entirely for the king's comfort. By the end of his reign, Henry's banquets were not only a symbol of excess, they were a grim metaphor for the widening divide between ruler and subject. The king was no longer simply feasting for pleasure. He was consuming the kingdom itself, one plate at a time. Perhaps the most unsettling dimension of Henry's gluttony was not merely its spectacle, but its direct influence on matters of state. Eyewitnesses described scenes in which the king, slouched in his padded chair, flushed with wine, and barely coherent, would nonetheless proceed with decisions of national consequence. Treaties were signed. Wars were declared. Death warrants were approved, all while the king was in the midst of a feast, surrounded by platters of half-eaten game birds, sugared confections, and goblets of claret. It is difficult to imagine the fate of an empire hanging on the whims of a man too intoxicated to hold a pen straight. And yet, this was the reality of the Tudor court in its final years. The most grotesque irony, however, was the way Henry's decaying body and compulsive appetite fed into one another. The more his health deteriorated, the more he turned to food for comfort, for distraction, even perhaps for control. His infected legs throbbed with pain. He could no longer ride, hunt, or even walk without assistance. And so he ate to pass the time, to dull the agony, to assert a kind of power over his failing flesh. But the cycle was relentless. Food made his condition worse, which made him more sedentary, more frustrated, and more reliant on food to fill the void. Servants whispered concerns in private, not just about the king's health, but about his survival. On more than one occasion, Henry is said to have eaten to the point of collapse, vomiting mid-meal from overindulgence, only to demand that the banquet continue. It was a spectacle of royal self-destruction, witnessed in real-time decadence taken to such an extreme that it threatened to consume not only the man, but the monarchy itself. By the final years of his reign, Henry's stomach had stretched to such unnatural proportions that even multiple-course meals left him restless and unsatisfied. But it wasn't merely hunger that drove him. Food had become his refuge, a source of comfort, control, and identity at a time when everything else in his life was falling apart. His body had turned against him. His mind, perhaps clouded by pain, head trauma, and disease, no longer served him as it once had. But in the great halls of his palaces, he could still summon a feast that will demand the roasting of exotic birds, the stewing of venison, the carving of entire pigs. He could compel courtiers to sit and watch him eat, to praise his appetite and mask their horror behind practiced smiles. Food in these final years became more than nourishment. It became a symbol of royal dominance, a grotesque form of theater in which the king asserted his power not by commanding armies, but by consuming extravagance in front of a starving kingdom. The waste was staggering. Leftovers from a single royal meal could have sustained entire villages. Yet much of it was discarded or tossed to dogs rather than shared with the poor. It wasn't just a matter of indulgence. It was an embodiment of inequality so extreme, it bordered on ritual cruelty. Even the royal physicians, charged with safeguarding the king's health, dared not tell him the truth. To suggest that his eating might be harming him was to risk accusations of treason or worse, disfavor. And so, day after day, they remained silent, watching their sovereign slowly devour himself. This was not just the decline of a man. It was the slow collapse of a court, a kingdom held hostage by one man's appetite. By the end of his reign, Even Henry's physicians were silenced by fear. To suggest that the king's lifestyle might be harmful to question his choices was to risk being accused of treason. And so, the men tasked with preserving his health stood by helplessly, watching their sovereign slowly consume himself, both in body and in mind. The irony was unmistakable. The very power that gave Henry the freedom to indulge in anything he wished, lavish banquets, rare delicacies, unlimited wine also, insulated him from the truth. No one dared to speak the words that might have prolonged his life. No one could tell the king enough. But perhaps most chilling of all was not what Henry ate, but how he ruled in these final years. His paranoia had metastasized, spreading through the court like a silent infection. It wasn't just personal distrust anymore. It was a system, an atmosphere of constant fear, a kingdom ruled by suspicion. In his later days, Henry transformed royal life into a waking nightmare, where the smallest misstep could prove fatal. Saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could mean imprisonment, or worse. Spies were everywhere, and courtiers quickly learned to measure every word, every gesture. Even the king's sleep became a battlefield. Henry refused to slumber without a loaded crossbow by his side and tucked multiple daggers beneath his pillow. Some nights he would wake in terror, certain he was being poisoned or attacked. Guards were posted just outside his chamber doors, but that wasn't enough. He demanded complete control over who could enter, and frequently changed his chamber staff out of fear that even his closest attendants might betray him. His palaces, once filled with music, diplomacy, and vibrant court life, grew increasingly hushed and cold monuments to isolation, not majesty. And yet, just beyond the palace gates, life went on for ordinary people who toiled in fields, endured harsh winters with meager food, and shared cramped homes with extended families. The contrast was staggering. While Henry ate himself into physical collapse and slept beneath a canopy of weapons, most of his subjects were lucky to eat once a day and lived under real threats of poverty and illness, not imagined plots of treason. Even in sleep, Henry found no peace. Each night, armed guards were stationed inside the king's bedchamber, instructed to remain alert while he rested. They were not there for ceremony. They were there because Henry truly believed, that someone might try to kill him in his sleep. He couldn't close his eyes without witnesses. But even that wasn't enough. Henry, increasingly tormented by suspicion, ordered that the guards be rotated every few hours. The same man standing at the foot of his bed too long might begin to plot. Better to swap them out, constantly, relentlessly, and because he no longer trusted the guards, he assigned guards to watch the guards. Each layer of protection gave birth to another. The king's bedchamber, once the most private space in the kingdom, became a living monument to his fear. A place where silence was enforced not by sleep, but by surveillance. Outside that chamber, the palace began to transform. What had once been designed for splendor and ceremony was now redesigned for escape. Under Henry's command, secret passages were carved into stone walls, tucked behind tapestries and under staircases. Not for trysts or privacy, but for flight. If someone came for him, he wanted to vanish without a trace. These were not the whims of a whimsical monarch. They were the behaviors of a man gripped by a slow, private unraveling who saw betrayal in every shadow. The palace, in all its gilded beauty, had become something closer to a prison, a maze of exits for a king who no longer felt safe in his own kingdom. Outside those stone walls, life looked very different. England's common folk slept six to a bed, huddled together for warmth. They had no guards, no escape tunnels, just trust in one another and the daily rituals of survival. Where the king was shadowed by swords and whispers, they were watched only by the changing skies above their thatched rooftops. The contrast was stark. One man surrounded by splendor and suspicion, the others bound by poverty and simplicity. But perhaps, in many ways, The poor slept more peacefully. The fear wasn't just at night. It followed them in the daylight, too. Henry had peepholes built into the walls of his palaces, quiet little openings that allowed him to watch his courtiers without being seen. He had primitive listening devices hidden in meeting rooms, so even whispered conversations could be overheard. The technology was simple mechanical funnels, hidden tubes, but the impact on the royal court was profound. No one ever knew when the king might be watching or listening. And so, every laugh, every gesture, every shared glance was measured. It became less about what was said and more about what could be imagined. But Henry's suspicions didn't stop there. He created an entire network of informants, spies whose sole purpose was to report on others. And then he had spies to spy on the spies. Informants watching informants. A kingdom tangled in a web of mistrust. A court where every step might echo in the wrong ears. The most painful cruelty, though, was how this fear turned inward, not just against strangers or courtiers, but against family. Children were encouraged to inform on their parents. Spouses were rewarded for revealing each other's secrets. Servants, once loyal and trusted, were offered coin for whispers. Trust became dangerous. A warm embrace might lead to suspicion. A shared joke might be seen as conspiracy. Henry had built something few rulers ever dared, a society where loyalty to the crown came before love, before friendship, even before blood. Meanwhile, outside palace walls, England's common folk had their own hardships, but their bonds were often stronger. A shared meal in a cottage might be poor in ingredients, but rich in trust. Neighbors helped each other because they had to, because they wanted to, because there were no spies in the hedgerows. Inside the castle, wealth could buy walls of gold, but not peace of mind. Henry's food paranoia reached almost surreal proportions. Meals were no longer simply prepared, they were orchestrated like military operations. Dozens of hands moved carefully through the royal kitchens, each one watched by another, and then another still. The ingredients salt, water, herbs were all tested separately, sometimes by different people, sometimes multiple times. Even the plates and spoons were examined for poison before being allowed near the king. The kitchens were sealed. Guards stood by every fire and every chopping block. And yet, even with all these precautions, the staff lived in quiet fear. One wrong flavor, one spoiled fig, and it could be interpreted not as a mistake, but as treason. The weight of that possibility was constant and heavy. But the king's suspicions didn't stop at the kitchen door. Henry began to distrust even his own children. He had spies placed near his daughters, Princess Mary and young Elizabeth, convinced without evidence that they were plotting to overthrow him. These were not grown rivals. These were girls, children, growing up under a roof where their father believed them to be potential enemies. Imagine what it must have felt like to know your own father had you watched, not for safety, but for signs of betrayal. Mary would grow quiet and guarded, shaped by years of mistrust. Elizabeth would become careful with her words, her silence as much a tool of survival as her intelligence. The walls of the palace, once built to protect them, had become silent witnesses to a father's fears and to the emotional distance it carved between them. Perhaps the most haunting expression of Henry's paranoia was seen in how he treated the women closest to him, his wives. Each marriage slowly unraveled into a quiet war of the mind. Love and companionship were replaced by suspicion and surveillance. Henry, no longer able to trust even the people who shared his bed, devised small tests, elaborate traps meant to uncover betrayal where there was none. He would send servants with whispers, false stories, invented conversations, to see how his wife might react. Would she defend him? Would she falter? Sometimes he would feign illness, not for sympathy, but to observe her response, as though a loving wife should cry just the right amount, no more, no less. But the testing went beyond games. Spies followed each queen throughout the day, reporting even the softest conversations, noting every glance, every pause, every sigh. Privacy vanished. Personal moments were no longer hers to keep. The walls watched, and the silence reported back. These women were not partners, they were prisoners. Not in name, but in spirit. Always watched, never certain which moment might be twisted into evidence of treason. And as Henry's mind grew darker, so too did his judgments. People began to die for things they hadn't done. A bad dream, a rumor, a whisper in a hallway was enough to summon the axe. Men and women were taken to the Tower, not because they had betrayed the king, but because someone believed one day they might. The cells filled with ghosts of the future people punished for imagined crimes, trapped in a world where fear had replaced law, and the king's nightmares were enough to end lives. Perhaps one of the most unsettling examples of Henry's growing detachment from reality came with the fate of the Marquis of Exeter, a man who had served Henry with loyalty for years. There was no evidence of treason, no plot, no uprising, only a dream. Henry dreamt that the Marquis had betrayed him, and that alone was enough. The dream lingered, twisted itself into certainty, and became justification for an execution. One man's nightmare became another man's death sentence. That moment marked a turning point, a chilling message to the rest of the court. Loyalty was not protection, and innocence was no shield. If the king's imagination turned against you, there was no defense. Fear spread like smoke through the corridors of power. Nobles began to spy on each other not for glory, but for survival. Servants quietly betrayed masters, not out of malice, but out of fear that silence might look like complicity. And even families whispered carefully around one another, never quite sure who might be listening or what might be repeated. The court became a place of shadow and echo, where words were weighed as carefully as gold, and trust became a dangerous luxury. Henry's paranoia was no longer his alone. It had become a system, a culture, a quiet, ever-present pressure that shaped behavior, strained relationships, and rewrote what it meant to serve a king. And in time, this fear spread beyond the palace walls, settling over England like a cold fog. The people lived not under law, but under mood. Not under justice, but under a ruler's flickering suspicion. In Henry's England, trust became a dangerous luxury. Friends grew cautious. Families guarded their words. Even the most loyal of servants moved carefully, watching every gesture, every sentence, knowing that the wrong word could mean ruin. Every relationship became a risk. Every conversation a calculation. And in the end, that was the tragedy. Henry's paranoia didn't protect him. It undid him. The very fear he hoped would keep betrayal at bay ended up severing him from the people who might have cared for him most. Loyalty, once given freely, turned brittle under suspicion. Those who had once been devoted began to retreat, fearful and resentful. And those who may have harbored ill intent simply grew more careful, more skilled at deception. The elaborate web of surveillance Henry had spun meant to shield him instead became a prison of his own design, a fortress of suspicion that walled him off from every genuine human connection. The king who had once ruled with such force and confidence ended his days surrounded by eyes, but utterly alone. He had the crown, the palaces, the power, but not peace, not trust, not love. The very tools he used to preserve his authority had stripped away the joy of wielding it. And so, as the candlelight faded in the royal chambers and the whispers of the court quieted for the night, England was left with a king who had everything except the one thing he could never command: peace of mind. The man who had once been greeted with cheers, young, golden, full of promise, ended his days as a ghost in his own court. Suspicious, swollen, surrounded, the halls he once walked with ease became claustrophobic corridors of fear, echoing with whispers, not loyalty. His kingdom had not grown more stable, only more watchful, more afraid. Ironically, the layers of guards, the hidden corridors, The food tasters and spy networks, they did not keep danger out. They only locked fear in. The true threat to Henry's safety was never in his enemies. It lived in his own mind. And yet, the story does not end with his last breath. Because even in death, Henry managed to leave a final act of grotesque spectacle behind. A body so bloated and decayed that it horrified those assigned to care for it. A coffin that leaked. A corpse that ruptured. His final procession became a slow-moving horror show, as if his physical remains were protesting burial, insisting on one more moment of control, one more act of disruption. There, in the dark shadow of the abbey, England buried a king and exhaled, not with grief, but with relief. And as the doors of the tomb closed behind him, they did not seal away greatness. They sealed away a legacy of waste, fear, and unmatched excess, a warning wrapped in velvet, resting beneath stone. Let us begin, slowly, with the final weeks of Henry's life. By this time, he could no longer stand, let alone walk. His body, once athletic, admired, had swollen beyond recognition. Servants no longer merely attended to him. They transported him. A custom-built chair with wheels and pulleys had become his only means of movement. It took teams of men to shift his weight from chamber to chamber. But it was not the weight alone that troubled the palace. Henry was rotting. The wounds on his legs' ulcers that never healed deepened over the years. They festered, oozed, and refused all remedy. And in those last days, they did more than weep or stink. They opened. They shed pieces of him. Small bits of dead flesh, blackened and soft, would fall as his chair creaked down the stone halls. The scent lingered long after the king had passed. And behind him, always, followed a servant with cloth in one hand and a bucket in the other. His duty was simple: to collect the king, to clean up what the king left behind. There are no heroic songs for this job. No reward, just silence. And the quiet task of pretending that this was all still noble. Day after day, night after night, the same procession. The chair, the smell, the slow, grim harvest of a once glorious body unraveling in real time. And then, there was the smell. By the final weeks, the odor from Henry's decaying body had become unbearable. Even for physicians long accustomed to medieval wounds and battlefield injuries, the scent was too much to endure. It is said they would quietly excuse themselves, retreat down candlelit halls, and vomit in silence behind closed doors. The stench reached into other rooms, drifting through tapestries and under heavy oak doors. Servants moved through the palace with perfumed cloths pressed tightly to their faces. Those summoned to the king's side entered like mourners, approaching a crypt, not to serve a monarch, but to bear witness to his slow disintegration. Contemporaries likened the smell to the open sewers of London, a comparison that carries more weight than we might assume. For in 16th century England, that meant something truly unimaginable. The physical transformation was just as shocking. Henry's body had become swollen beyond recognition, his skin stretched so tightly that it shone like wax left too near the flame. His limbs were thick and waterlogged, his belly vast, his wounds deep and foul-leaked without end. Those who saw him in these final days said he resembled no living creature they had ever known. But the most haunting part of Henry's final decline was not how he looked. It was how alone he had become. This was a man who had once ruled through fear, who had ended lives with a glance or a signature, now entirely dependent on the very people he had spent decades terrifying. The same servants who once trembled at his anger now had to lift him, clean him, soothe his sores, and change his bedding. And in the flickering candlelight of his sick room, the horror became quiet. There was no justice, no vengeance, no redemption. Just the cold, slow collapse of a man who had tried to control everything and could now control nothing. There is an old saying whispered in the corners of forgotten monasteries and firelit inns. A king may command the realm, but not the rot. And in the final days of Henry VIII's life, that truth became tragically, almost poetically clear. The irony was sharp for those who had survived his court. This was a man who had claimed the divine right to rule, who insisted that his authority came straight from the heavens. And yet, he could not even control his own body. By that winter of 1547, portable toilets followed him everywhere, wheeled discreetly behind his chair by silent, stone-faced attendants. He could not walk. He could not clean himself. He could not even rise unassisted. The man who once demanded absolute obedience now depended entirely on the people he once ruled with iron cruelty. And when the end finally came on the 28th of January, it was as if even death hesitated, because no one, not even his personal physicians, wanted to approach the body. The stench had worsened. The skin had turned. The room was thick with it. And still they waited, watching from a distance, uncertain whether it was over, or whether he might suddenly groan and stir again. It took hours before someone found the courage to step forward and confirm what everyone already suspected. Henry VIII was dead, but the story does not end there, because even in death, Henry's body continued to rebel. He had grown so swollen with gases, the natural byproduct of internal decomposition, that his coffin had to be specially reinforced. The pressure inside his corpse was so intense that cracks began to appear in the casket itself. According to one deeply unsettling historical account, the coffin began to leak, seeping foul fluid into the floor beneath it as it made its slow procession to burial. Servants were seen covering their mouths and turning away, not out of mourning, but nausea. It was, in the quietest, most grotesque way, a final performance. One last act of decay from a man who had ruled through spectacle and fear. And as his body continued to break apart inside its grand and gilded prison, one could almost hear the whispered thoughts of every trembling courtier, every long-suffering servant. So this is what becomes of kings. You might imagine that, once confirmed dead, Henry VIII's body would finally find peace. But the chaos he brought to England in life refused to leave him in death. His attendants tried to prepare. They wrapped his decaying body in heavy lead sheets, sealed it tightly in multiple wooden boxes, and prayed that these layers would contain what he had become, a once mighty king, now reduced to gas, fluid, and rot. But the reality was far beyond what they could contain. The funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle, meant to be a solemn and reverent affair, soon unraveled into a spectacle of horror that would linger in the minds of all who witnessed it. Somewhere along the journey, perhaps on a quiet country road, beneath gray skies, it happened. The pressure from the decomposing gases inside Henry's body became too much, and his coffin burst. Not cracked, not seeped. It exploded. The lead lining ruptured. The wood split open, and rotting flesh, royal fluids, and the unmistakable stench of decay filled the hearse like a wave. Servants, stunned, stopped the procession immediately. They scrambled with buckets and cloths, trying to contain the disaster. But nothing could fully erase the sight or the smell. Imagine being one of those men, scoop by scoop, bucket by bucket, gathering the remnants of your king, trying not to retch with each step. This was no longer a royal funeral. It was a cleanup operation soaked in trauma. And then there was the detail whispered afterward, too horrifying for the official records, but too vivid to forget. Stray dogs, drawn by the smell, reportedly seen, licking the blackened trail left by Henry's leaking coffin. Whether it was true or not no longer mattered. The image remained, and it told a story as powerful as any inscription carved into stone. Even the greatest monarch can be reduced to something so foul, so forgotten, that the animals come to feast where mourners once knelt. The man who once claimed he ruled by divine right, who insisted he was God's chosen representative on earth, did not pass into the next world with dignity or reverence. He ended his reign not in glory, not in triumph, but scattered across a country highway, consumed by time, by decay, and, yes, perhaps even by dogs. The symbolism couldn't have been more stark if it had been written by a poet. Even Henry's burial became a grotesque struggle. His coffin, swollen with gases and reinforced with lead, was too heavy for the earth itself. They had to dig extra wide, reinforce the ground, and attempt again and again to lower him without the grave collapsing beneath him. Eventually, they succeeded, but even then, the earth seemed reluctant to accept him. Construction on his tomb was delayed for years, not by politics, not by war, but because no one wanted to work near the site of his rot. The smell lingered long after the funeral procession ended, for weeks, then months. People in the surrounding area reported it. Whispers spread. Was it his soul? Was it punishment? Strange noises were heard near the tomb at night, groaning and creaking, like something inside trying to move or escape. Some said it was Henry's ghost, too swollen with sins to rest peacefully. Others, more practical, believed it was simply the final gases of decomposition escaping the coffin, his body continuing to dissolve in ways nature itself seemed reluctant to complete. But whatever the truth, it left a mark. The king who had once terrorized a nation, who had bent church and court and country to his will, ended up in a grave that could barely contain him, surrounded by rumors, rot, and revulsion. And that, perhaps more than any royal proclamation or monument, is the legacy Henry left behind. A reign remembered not just for its power, but for its profound and unforgettable decay. In the end, it was as if his body refused to decay the way a normal man's would, as if even death struggled to process everything Henry had become. The infections, the rot, the unnatural bloating, the grotesque horror of his final form became more than physical. It became symbolic. For those who witnessed it firsthand, the trauma was deep and lasting. Several servants who cared for the king in his final days succumbed not just to disease, but to exhaustion, to fear, to something deeper, a kind of psychological collapse after a lifetime of service to a man who saw people as disposable tools in his empire of paranoia. They had lived in his shadow, and even in death, his shadow clung to them. Because perhaps that was Henry's greatest legacy, not glory, not conquest, but trauma. A reign soaked in blood, betrayal, and control. A body that fell apart as violently and obscenely as the court he had ruled. And a coffin that couldn't contain the consequences of a life so grotesquely lived. The explosion of Henry's coffin, the final symbol. A literal rupture of power, corruption, and decay. So now, centuries later, we lie in the quiet, far from the court of Henry VIII, far from the rot and fear and madness of his time. And we remember that no amount of power, no level of control, no divine right or golden crown can stop a man from becoming dust. Sleep well, dear listener. You've made it through the court of King Henry VIII, and you've come out the other side. History doesn't always comfort, but in remembering, we learn, we reflect, and eventually we rest. And so, the man who lived without limits, who devoured more than food, who consumed loyalty, dignity, even lives, was finally consumed himself by disease, by decay, and, in the most ironic end imaginable, by the very earth and animals he once ruled over. All the crowns and gold, all the courtiers and castles, could not change the simple truth of his ending, that no amount of power can preserve a soul that rots from within. Henry VIII did not go quietly. He did not pass with peace or dignity. Instead, his death, like his life, was a final act of chaos, explosive, grotesque, and deeply, disturbingly human. But now, the fires have gone out. The throne stands empty. The halls of Whitehall and Windsor are silent. And the only thing that remains is history, softened by time, muffled by memory. So let us now leave behind the shadows of Tudor England and drift away, far from the paranoia, far from the pain, far from the shattered legacy of a king who demanded everything and gave back nothing but fear. Close your eyes now. Let the echoes fade. You're safe. You've survived the court of Henry VIII. And now you can sleep. Henry VIII's death should have brought relief to England. Yet the psychological and political scars he left behind during his 38-year reign continued to haunt the kingdom long after his decaying body was finally laid to rest in a reinforced tomb. This was a trauma that spanned generations, affecting not only those who lived through his rule, but also their descendants. His surviving daughter, Mary, was deeply scarred by witnessing how her father treated her mother, Catherine of Aragon. Throughout her own reign, she worked to undo much of Henry's legacy and became known as Bloody Mary for her brutal persecution of Protestants. The mental wounds from growing up under Henry's paranoid watch, watching her mother be systematically broken down and living in constant fear that she might suffer the same fate transformed Mary into a ruler who governed through terror and violence. Elizabeth, Henry's other surviving daughter, endured her own trauma, though she coped differently. She was only 2 when her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed, and throughout her childhood, she lived in uncertainty over her legitimacy, depending on Henry's changing moods. These experiences fostered in Elizabeth deep mistrust and paranoia that shaped her entire reign. Henry's reign of terror permanently disrupted the traditional structures of the English aristocracy. The religious upheaval sparked by his break with Rome did not end with his death. Instead, it continued to fracture England for generations. His choice to declare himself head of the English Church was driven not by sincere religious beliefs, but by his personal desire to divorce Catherine of Aragon. This selfish act set off centuries of religious conflict, persecution, and civil wars that claimed thousands of lives. Perhaps most unsettlingly, Henry's rule established dangerous precedents regarding royal authority. The notion that a monarch could unilaterally alter laws, execute nobles, and reshape institutions to fit personal wishes became embedded in the monarchy's playbook. Subsequent kings saw Henry not as a warning against the corrupting influence of unchecked power, but as a model of what absolute authority could achieve. Meanwhile, the financial strain caused by Henry's extravagant lifestyle and endless wars nearly bankrupted the nation. His insatiable appetite, lavish palaces, and costly military endeavors drained the royal coffers, leaving England burdened with debts that took decades to overcome. The man who proclaimed himself England's greatest king had, in reality, driven the nation to the edge of financial ruin. Yet the most enduring harm Henry caused was psychological. He turned England from a fairly stable medieval realm into a paranoid surveillance state where trust was shattered. Personal bonds were sacrificed for political survival, and a single careless word could mean death. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion he fostered did not fade with his passing. It left a lasting mark on how the English related to both authority and one another. So now you know the true Henry VIII, stripped of the romantic myths and historical gloss that have oddly transformed one of history's most repulsive tyrants into a figure of intrigue rather than horror. This was not a flawed but charismatic ruler, or a tragic man corrupted by power. This was a deeply broken individual, physically grotesque and mentally warped, whose presence left trauma in his wake. Perhaps the most unsettling part of Henry VIII's legacy isn't only what he did, but how history has tried to cleanse his image. We have somehow turned a man whose body was literally decaying while he lived, who inflicted psychological torment on his wives before ordering their deaths, and whose paranoia transformed an entire kingdom into a prison of surveillance, into the hero of romantic movies and TV dramas. It is as if society has chosen to forget the brutal truth about who Henry VIII really was. Henry VIII stands as a grim example of what humans can become when granted unchecked power and allowed to act without consequence. His story is not mere entertainment. It is a stark warning about the dangers of concentrating too much authority in the hands of one person, and the critical need to hold leaders accountable. So next time you see Henry VIII glamorized as some larger-than-life romantic figure, remember, his servants forced to clean up his rotting flesh, the wives who lived in constant fear of his violent outbursts, and the thousands of lives destroyed because this man could not control his paranoid delusions. Remember, just as his coffin could not hold the corruption of his decaying body, his kingdom could not contain the corruption of his soul. This is the true face of unchecked power. This is what happens when monsters are allowed to wear crowns. And this is why we must never forget the real, horrifying story of Henry VIII, not the myth, but the brutal reality of England's darkest monarch.